Buenos días en Lima, buenas tardes en Londres. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos en el G0 Summit de América Latina organizado por Eurasia Group. Tengo el honor de dirigir esta sesión con Julio Velarde, presidente del Banco Central de Perú. Muchos ya conocen de su larga trayectoria, así que no voy a ahondar en detalles, pero Julio Velarde fue ratificado recientemente como presidente del Banco Central de Reserva del Perú. Ha sido reconocido en varias oportunidades como banquero del año por distintas publicaciones y ha sido presidente del Banco Central de Reserva del Perú desde el 2006. Muchas gracias por estar hoy con nosotros, doctor Velarde.
Gracias a ustedes.
Bueno, empiezo por su reciente ratificación. Su confirmación como presidente del Banco Central, como gobernador del Banco Central, brindó tranquilidad al mercado en medio de la alta incertidumbre producida por la elección presidencial. Me gustaría saber qué lo motivó, qué consideraciones tuvo para seguir en el cargo luego de tantos años ocupa este puesto desde el 2006.
Bueno, un primer factor fue que me lo propuso el presidente sin consultarme en una reunión pública. Entonces tuve la presión del sencillo, ¿no? En este caso fue realmente había preparado a mi sucesor. Desgraciadamente, que ha trabajado conmigo 15 años, falleció por COVID. Pero el segundo factor, ligado un poco a esto, es que sí tenía el temor que no se nombrara alguien más convencional, más mainstream. Lo que creía que era importante para brindar confianza y en la estabilidad macroeconómica que podía permanecer, ¿no? Y el tercer factor que hace que lo aceptes es que probablemente no les guste el cargo, ¿no? Y eso converso con varios colegas, les gusta la banca central. Pero el principal factor fue un poco, antes de asumir el presidente una administración pública, una plaza de Lima, dijo que iba a pedir mi ratificación. Entonces, una presión muy fuerte para aceptar de alguna forma u otra, ¿no?
Y han sido unos, un año, un par de años bastante complicados, no solo por la coyuntura local, sino obviamente por la situación global y por la pandemia. Y hablando estrictamente del 2021, el Banco Central ha intervenido frecuentemente en el mercado para contener la volatilidad del tipo de cambio. ¿Considera usted que la presión más fuerte sobre el sol ya pasó, como de hecho mencionó hace algunos meses?
Sí, hemos intervenido con bastante fuerza. Hemos vendido 11.600 millones de dólares, la intervención más fuerte que hemos hecho en la historia, y derivados por casi 6.000 millones. Pero déjeme agregar un punto. Aún así tenemos casi 11.000 millones más de reservas que ante la pandemia. O sea,
we have all these changes because of the pandemic. We do have some changes that actually started out from Mexico. So then we had the elections. And actually then we had about 4 billion. And between April and July, we actually had over 200 million. In October, it actually went down. So what has happened so far is that we believe that the worst has already passed, but we have, yes, intervened and pressured constantly. Our government is still paying dividends from the previous years. And well, we have the whole usage of capital to try and attract more money from investments. And the banks, they have put more than $2 million in the investments. So the banks have already actually brought from the United States over $200 billion. So this entire scenario we're having the government a lot of difficult times from what we have been having in the past, and also what we hope to see in the future. So there are a lot of measures that have to be taken so far. And what does the central bank have in line to try and fight this social uncertainty, given that this scenario is not going to end? Well, the government is not going to change, and neither is the central bank, but we were able to stop this breakdown from the market. In the past 2 years, I guess the majority of the country has suffered with the inflation. However, we are not. We still have an answer addressing all the previous measures that we had, but the difference that we had from the futures from the other countries is the taxation. The central bank have been working together with the government, and we also must remember that the difference between us and the other countries of the world is that our constitution establishes that a Peruvian person has the freedom to work with any currencies from the world. So when we compare to Argentina, even in the scenario that we had in 2019, we had this capital per capita, and we couldn't change that. I don't know if that actually addresses your question or not. Yes, and actually I would like now to start thinking about next year and what are the expectations we have for the next year. And it's obviously connected to the previous question. What do you believe are the main mistakes and goals for the Peruvian economy in 2022? And how do you compare them? And what's the difference they have with what you face compared to your neighbors in the region? Well, political scenarios are different among the countries, of course. And one case that I have in mind is Chile. We can see that there has been a depreciation, and they have been trying to strengthen the economy after that. We also have a whole situation going on in Colombia. But here we have a president that is very invested in working in this part of the economy. So of course the countries are different. However, there is a very strong trend of growth. So if we can keep the levels that we had in September, especially this year, I believe we can see that there is an increase of 4% when we compare to 2019. And we believe that this movement of starting to recover is something that's going to keep happening until next year. But what the greatest fear that we have when you talk about a radical government here is to have an inefficiency in the government. We have, or maybe having management problems, and even having an excessive microeconomic intervention from the government. And obviously, in the macro scenario, we again have the problem of inflation. Okay, thank you. And actually, as a part of the question, we obviously have to talk about inflation, not only in Latin America, but also in the world. Inflation has been increasing. So what are the actors or the factors in play here that the central bank can work to try and attend to the demand, or to, of course, we know that the inflation is always going to reflect in other actions. So what does the ministry have in mind? Of course, that the central banks, do they have to wait? What they have to expect? Well, first of all, our ministries, historically, of course, maybe in Asia we don't have such a history, but here in Latin America, we could see that the lockdowns were not so strict here in Latin America. So this is a factor, of course. But I believe that it's also have to do a lot of energy. In emerging countries in general, we do have a great influence from the energy sector. Of course, we also have this problem of an expanding demand. So basically, this is what have been happening when we talk about the shifts in the market here. Now, what many central banks did, including Peru's, of course, we had worked on 25 basic points. And since August, we were able to resume a recovery of about 5%. So of course that we know that we definitely need stimulus packages, but all the central banks are also afraid of having this inflation in a way that we basically would have to work a miracle to make it work. And third, there are some scenarios that are related to the future. For example, the moments that we have in the United States, they can have an impact. So if we want to face this issue in a better way, we have to maybe inspire ourselves in Mexico. Are you worried about the central banks of industrialized countries can normalize their interests, or maybe make their monetary and financial policies more strict? Well, clearly, yes, this is a concern of ours. However, the difference is, first of all, we do believe that the communication is going to be better. Communication in this moment is key. And second of all, the capital flow are not as high as they used to be when we compare, for example, to 2011 to 2013. And in the case of Peru, we had a lot of different situations here going on, especially when we talk about national assets. So we can see that there was a very strong exit of currency. So of course, we are also worried about the whole situation that started in March last year. But in the case of all the countries in Latin America, we know that there is an increase of interest. Obviously, what happens is that it's kind of it's more and more difficult to, well, basically we are definitely going to have to work in the federal country to change this monetary and financial politics without making a lot of waves in the capital market. And we know that our assets are already in play. So of course that we are always comparing to the scenario that we had in 2013. However, we still don't know if the consequences are going to be as dramatic as the ones that we had in 2013. to Peru and the region. But when we compare Peru and the other countries, we can see that there is a rising insatisfaction of the population. And of course, they are demanding an improvement in public services, and of course, facing the corruption. And this is, of course, something that has already happening before the pandemic. We have seen a lot of different manifestations. And this is one of the main characteristics that we have when we talk about the elections that we had in Peru and Chile and Colombia. So how concerned are you with citizen satisfaction, and what are you going to do to face those challenges in a context where we have this concern of economic growth, and when we have, of course, tax restrictions and other challenges that the government is facing? Well, about this the quality of life. So I do believe that we are still missing more strength from the government to try and tackle all of those challenges that the country and all the countries in Latin America are having. I do believe that other factors are also in play. And not only this change in the administration, but the way that the public services actually handle the situation of the
during the COVID pandemics. And we have some sectors like education with a lot of problems. In other countries from Latin America, we have a low quality service. The access to the public service is really limited. I saw everything in a lot of countries. In Peru, this was really visible, right? And if to canalize all this this unsatisfaction on the streets, on the elections, this context is having an impact on the capacity of the governments to do reforms, especially in unpopular, that where we were recently had in the beginning of the year, we had this, they tried to do a taxation reform in Colombia. Do you see any space for huge reforms, even in Peru, in some other places? I see a need of reforms, but it will depend of some politicians that can convince the population of how to do these reforms. Obviously, we need to find a consensus to this will be more disruptive as possible, but this is urgent. I think that part of the reforms that was done, a lot of people gain, not just companies, but work organizations, not just companies that had power, but the higher oppositors most of the times can be like a syndicate, like a union that can benefit with this part. It was something complicated that we need for good politicians, and good politicians are missing all over the world, not just here in this region. So you were on central bank for several years. There is any effort to coordination between the different central banks, particularly in the context, in the pandemic context? Well, when we have a crisis, we have a tendency we tend to help each other. When we had this crisis, we had this emergency meeting with more than 6 countries in this region. And we had these countries for the Pacific Islands. So since the pandemics, we had a lot of virtual meetings. But after that, we had other forums with other Latin America countries like Canada, United States, to discuss common issues to all countries. We have a reserve fund there. Well, we have in exchange a lot of experience exchange, and the coordination it's improving, but we always have a lot of dialogue. And in this sense, we observed as well efforts from different central banks to work on create a virtual coin. How are the plans to create a virtual coin can be implemented in the short term, or is a long-term thing? No, we are taking baby steps. The first baby step was not going to be the first ones, but we don't want to be the last of them. Most of the central banks are working on this digital coin and still need to define a lot of aspects. If it's going to be retail, wholesale market in cities, risks, cyber security, a lot of subjects. So it's a process. We're going to take a lot of years, and probably we're going to learn from the first ones. That's why we don't want to be among the first, but we don't want to be on the last. Anyhow, we need to move forward and start working. So we have a team working a lot, but it's a long-term process. We have here some questions from our audience. The first one is, how do you see the pandemic and the impact on the economy given this new variant, Omicron? This changed your perspective about this economic issue to 2022? Well, independently of to be light one or strong one that will affect us, the tourism, a lot of sectors were affected, like the hotels, restaurants, not just they were afraid to be contaminated, can take back the people, but they are afraid to participate that involves more people. So maybe it will decrease the demand for our services as happened before. I don't believe that we will come back to the isolation the same way that we did in the beginning of the pandemic. So COVID left some scars, and we need to consider everybody has this sense that it will last longer than most believed, and think how this could affect the financial system. How many breaks, failures could happen during this time. And I think that the recovery was faster than we had imagined. And this has relation with the fact that after we finished the isolation, we recovered really quickly. And of course, we have a lot of scars, a lot of companies breaks, well, you know. But I don't think that this will repeat with this new variant. What we can assure at this time is that the risks are higher. That's the only thing that we know. And the issue about vaccination, the global vaccination, is something fundamental, essential to fight this pandemic. During your time in central bank, you saw a lot of domestic crisis, external crisis. Do you think that the pandemic and the last issues of monetary policies changed your vision about monetary policies? I learned that crises will always be here and we need to be prepared. This crisis used to be different one from another. The 2008 was terrible, and now this one, and I think it's okay. This sentence that the families are alike, the families are all alike, it's applied to crisis as well. What we have learned is that we cannot trust. For example, in Lima, most of the models were failure. And there was a confidence that the inflation will not increase. A lot of governments thought that this could happen, but inflation increased in some countries. Okay. Are you concerned or are afraid of a politicization of a monetary policy if the rates increase? Well, politicization in Latin America, it's always has to do with this fiscal issue. There are a lot of families in debt, in deep debt, and when we increase the fees, we have this reaction against most of the population. And we saw in other countries, we have this concern related to the inflation, and this is a problem. It's not only politicization, but in my case, look, recently we saw how the policies from Trump and Dow Jones crisis. So if you want to increase your rate, I think it always had pressures in the past. I expect that we don't policies this more and more, and the risk in a more developed country is that the only player will set the rules and this expose the central banks more. They think that they can do more than they can effectively do. You see politicization risk in the Peru's case. The central bank, it's always kept on a side independently. This could be modified in the future. Well, I don't say that in the future, but not in the short term. Short term, no. Related to this climate change, there is an issue to include this on the monetary policy. How do you see it? Well, a lot of banks, central banks, started to consider this, including the England Bank, but it's more visible. The central banks that has contrary supervision like Brazil and like the European banks, in this case, it's more visible. We try to turn things simpler, to buy more green bonuses, but we have more limitations that are imposed to our financial system to lend to more responsible companies.
So the Pacific coast we have the things being difficult from the Atlantic coast, especially in Argentina. And well, I also have a question. Do you consider that this has been the most complicated year of your career when it comes to the domestic aspects and the entire overview outlook that we had because of the pandemic? I mean, the 2 last years, have they been the more complicated ones when it comes for monetary policies? Well, in my case, we are in a scenario where we have to review everything because everything is decreasing. When it comes to monetary policies, we know that there are a lot of things that we cannot leave for tomorrow. So the situation that we had in 2018, for example, was that everyone wanted to have a vision for the 30. And I was actually a part of the committee about the inflation back then. But we could see that oil prices were constantly raising. And well, actually, that was a very difficult moment in Caracas, even more difficult than now. Okay, so can we expect to have these the same president for the central bank in the next few years? I mean, can we expect that? Maybe with a rectification in 2026? No, I don't. I surely hope not. Okay, are we going to accept audience questions? And if we don't, then we are done for today. So thank you very much for all of you guys for being here. And for the audience, I kindly ask you to be here for the next panel when we are going to discuss about the relationships between Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. So President of the Central Bank in Peru, thank you very much again for being here. And well, thank you very much. No, thank you. And